On 4 June 1629, Batavia struck Morning Reef near Beacon Island, part of the Houtman Abrojos off the western coast of Australia. Of the 322 aboard, most of the passengers and crew managed to get ashore, although 40 people drowned. The survivors, including all the women and children, were then transferred to nearby islands in the ship's longboat and yawl. An initial survey of the islands found no fresh water and only limited food, sea lions and birds. Pelsart realized the dire situation and decided to search for water on the mainland. A group consisting of Jacobson, Pelsart, senior officers, a few crew members, and some passengers left the wreck site in a 9-meter-long longboat in search of drinking water. After an unsuccessful search for water on the mainland, they left the other survivors and headed north in a danger-fraught voyage to the city of Batavia, Dutch East Indies, the ship's namesake, to seek rescue. Batavia was in the area of what is now Jakarta. En route, the crew made further forays onto the mainland in search of fresh water. In his journal, Pelsart stated that on 15 June 1629, they sailed through a channel between a reef and the coast, finding an opening around midday at a latitude guessed to be about 23 degrees south, where they were able to land and water was found. The group spent the night on land. Pelsart commented on the vast number of termite mounds in the vicinity and the plague of flies that afflicted them. Pelsart stated that they continued north with the intention of finding the River of Jacob Remesons, identified first in 1622, but owing to the wind were unable to land. Drake Brockman has suggested that this location is to be identified with Yardi Greek. It was not until the longboat reached the island of Nusa Kambangan in the Dutch East Indies that Pelsart and the others found more water. The journey took 33 days, with everyone surviving. After their arrival in Batavia, the boatswain, Jan Everts, was arrested and executed for negligence and outrageous behavior before the loss of the ship. He was suspected to have been involved. Jacobs was also arrested for negligence, although his culpability in the potential mutiny was not guessed by Pelsart. Governor-General Jan Peterson Kohn immediately gave Pelsart command of Sardam to rescue the other survivors, as well as to attempt to salvage riches from Batavia's wreck. Within a month, Pelsart reached the general area where the shipwreck had occurred, but it took another month of searching to locate the islands again. He finally arrived at the site, only to discover that a bloody massacre had taken place among the survivors, reducing their numbers by at least 100. Cornelis was one of the few men who stayed on Batavia to pillage and steal. He was one of the few who survived the final breakup of the ship and made it to Beacon Island after floating for 2 days. Though neither sailor nor soldier, Cornelis was elected to be in charge of the survivors due to his senior rank in the Dutch East India Company. He made plans to hijack any rescue ship that might return and use the vessel to seek another safe haven. Cornelis made far-fetched plans to start a new kingdom using the gold and silver from the wreck. However, to carry out this plan, he first needed to eliminate possible opponents. Cornelis's first deliberate act was to have all weapons and food supplies commandeered and placed under his control. He then moved a group of soldiers, led by Wiebe Hayes, to nearby West Wallaby Island, located roughly 8.7 kilometers or 5.4 miles to the northwest, under the pretense of having them search for water. They were told to send smoke signals when they found water, and they would then be rescued. Convinced that they would be unsuccessful, he then left them there to die, taking complete control of the remaining survivors. Cornelis's first deliberate act was to have all weapons and food supplies commandeered and placed under his control. He then moved a group of soldiers, led by Wiebe Hayes, to nearby West Wallaby Island, located roughly 8.7 kilometers or 5.4 miles to the northwest, under the pretense of having them search for water. They were told to send smoke signals when they found water, and they would then be rescued.
Convinced that they would be unsuccessful, he then left them there to die, taking complete control of the remaining survivors. Cornelis never committed any of the murders himself, although he tried and failed to poison a baby, who was eventually strangled. Instead, he coerced others into doing it for him, usually under the pretense that the victim had committed a crime, such as theft. Cornelis and his henchmen had originally murdered to save themselves, but eventually they began to kill for pleasure or out of habit. Cornelis planned to reduce the island's population to around 45 so that their supplies would last as long as possible. He also feared that many of the survivors remained loyal to the Dutch East India Company. In total, Cornelis's followers murdered at least 110 men, women, and children. A small number of women were kept as sex slaves. Among them was Jans, who Cornelis reserved for himself. In the May 2025 issue of the International Journal of Maritime History, Dutch academic and cultural psychologist Jacob Kohler published an article entitled "The Batavia Disaster, a New Scenario to Explain the Massacre After the Shipwreck," in which he argued that the unlikely story about a mad heretic, which has been repeated for 400 years, may be wrong. He proposed an alternative theory that rather than a dastardly plot, ordinary men were driven to terrible acts by starvation. Although Cornelius had left the soldiers, led by Hayes, to die, they had in fact found good sources of water and food on West Wallaby Island. Initially, they were unaware of the massacres taking place and sent prearranged smoke signals announcing their finds. However, they soon learned of the killings from survivors fleeing Beacon Island. In response, the soldiers devised makeshift weapons from materials washed up from the wreck. They also set a watch so that they were ready for Cornelius's men and built a small fort out of limestone and coral blocks. Cornelius seized on the news of water on the other island as his own supply was dwindling, and the continued survival of the soldiers threatened his own success. He was fearful that any rescue vessel would sight the soldiers first, therefore dispatched his men to eliminate this threat. But the trained soldiers were by now much better fed than Cornelius's group and easily defeated them in several battles. Seeking to bring Hayes under his command, he traveled to the island himself, whereby Hayes and his soldiers took Cornelius hostage. The men who escaped regrouped under soldier Wouter Loos and tried again, this time employing muskets to besiege Hayes's fort and almost defeating the soldiers. However, Hayes's men prevailed again just as Sardam arrived. A race to the rescue ship ensued between Cornelius's men and the soldiers. Hayes reached the ship first and was able to present his side of the story to Pelsart. After a short battle, the combined force captured all of Cornelius's group. Pelsart decided to conduct a trial on the islands because Sardam, on the return voyage to Batavia, would have been overcrowded with both survivors and prisoners. After a brief trial, the worst offenders were taken to Seal Island and executed. Cornelis and several of his henchmen had both hands chopped off before being hanged. Loos and a cabin boy, Jan Pelgrim de Bay, who were considered only minor offenders, were marooned on mainland Australia and were never heard of again. This made them the first Europeans to have permanently lived on the Australian continent. This location is now thought to be Wittakara Creek near Kalbarri, Western Australia, though another suggestion is nearby Port Gregory. The rest of Cornelis's henchmen were taken to Batavia for trial. 5 were hanged, while several others were flogged, keel-hauled, or dropped from the yardarm on the later voyage back home. Cornelis's second-in-command, Jacob Peters, was broken on the wheel, the most severe punishment available at the time. Jacobs, despite being tortured, did not confess to his part in plotting the mutiny and escaped execution due to lack of evidence. What finally became of him is unknown. He might have died in prison in Batavia. A board of inquiry decided that Pelsart had exercised a lack of authority and was therefore partly responsible for what had happened. His financial assets were seized, and he died within a year of disease. His journals on the matter would be published in 1647 and widely read, spreading knowledge of the dangers of the coast of Western Australia. Hayes was hailed a hero and promoted to sergeant, which increased his salary, while those who had been under his command were promoted to the rank of corporal. Of the original 332 people on board Batavia, only 122 made it to the port of Batavia. Sardam eventually sailed home with most of the treasure previously carried on Batavia. Of the 12 treasure chests that were originally on board, 10 were recovered and taken aboard Sardam. Hayes was hailed a hero and promoted to sergeant, which increased his salary, while those who had been under his command were promoted to the rank of corporal. Of the original 332 people on board Batavia, only 122 made it to the port of Batavia. Sardam eventually sailed home with most of the treasure previously carried on Batavia. Of the 12 treasure chests that were originally on board, 10 were recovered and taken aboard Sardam.
Surveying the northwest coast of the Abrojos Islands for the British Admiralty in April 1840, Captain John Lort Stokes reported that the beams of a large vessel were discovered, assumed to be Zeewick, on the southwest point of an island, reminding them that since Zeewick's crew reported having seen a wreck of a ship on this part, there was little doubt that the remains were those of the Batavia. In the 1950s, historian Henrietta Drake Brockman argued from extensive archival research that the Batavia wreck must lie in the Wallaby group of islands. The wreck was first sighted in 1963 by lobster fisherman David Johnson. A systematic archaeological investigation was carried out in the 1970s. Most of the excavation work was carried out over 4 years, starting in 1972 with an initial survey in 1971. A large amount of the surviving hull was raised and conserved. This is about 20 tons of timber, which is about 3.5% of the original ship's hull. Other large items included portside stern timbers, cannons, and an anchor. A large selection of smaller items were excavated, with many pottery containers, weapons, cooking equipment, navigation items, including 4 astrolabes. Added to this were various trade items carried as part of the ship's cargo. The excavation was carried out in challenging conditions, with the swell coming in from the Indian Ocean, preventing diving on 173 days of the 447 days spent on site. Some of that diving was restricted to the inner wreck site, where material had been carried to an area sheltered from the swell inside the reef. In the 4th season on site, starting September 1975, only 10 days of diving were possible on the more exposed main wreck site. To facilitate the monitoring and any future treatment, the hull timbers were erected on a steel frame. Its design, and that of a stone arch also recovered, was such that individual components could be easily removed. In 1972, the Dutch government transferred rights to Dutch shipwrecks in Australian waters to the Australian government. Excavated items are on display at the Western Australian Museum's various locations, though the majority of cannons and anchors have been left in situ. The wreck remains one of the premier diving sites on the Western Australian coast. In 2015, archaeological researchers from the University of Western Australia unearthed several skeletons believed to be from the Batavia. It was later reported that subsequent research over 5 years by an international research team of anthropologists and archaeologists had discovered the remains of 12 victims, interred in both individual and mass graves, as well as evidence of a fierce struggle between survivors and a group of mutineers. Batavia carried a considerable amount of silver coins, manufactured silverware items, and jewels. The manufactured silverware were trade goods that Pelsart had specifically requested to use in improving the VOC's trading capability. He had found that these were sought after by the great men he had dealt with in Agra. Though Pelsart's divers recovered some of the silverware in his salvage operations, a large quantity still remained to be recovered in the archaeological investigation. As well as more usual tableware, the silver finds included parts of bedsteads. Each ship in the Batavia class carried an estimated 250,000 guilders in 12 wooden chests, each containing about 8,000 silver coins.
This money was intended for the purchase of spices and other commodities in Java. The bulk of these coins were silver Rijksdaalder, produced by the individual Dutch states, with the remainder being mostly made up of similar coins produced by German cities such as H.